A bishop warned his church about betrayal from inside its own walls. 3 days later, he vanished. 15 years passed, until a burned body was finally recovered from a hidden chapel, almost nothing left but ash and a single piece of sacred clothing. What investigators found inside that fabric proved he never escaped. But it also exposed something far more dangerous, and someone still protected. Before we begin, if you love deep-dive true crime stories that expose secrets hidden behind power, religion, and silence, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this case almost disappeared forever. 15 years ago, inside a packed cathedral, a respected bishop made a chilling prophecy during a Sunday service. He said a fire would come. He said betrayal would rise from inside the church itself. And he said someone wearing holy garments would one day carry a secret that could destroy everything. 3 days later, the bishop vanished. No body, no suspects, no official investigation that ever reached the public. For 15 years, the church denied anything suspicious had happened, until a burned body was finally recovered from a collapsed rural chapel, reduced almost entirely to ash. What investigators found inside the remains should have been impossible. A fragment of ceremonial papal ware, still partially intact, and stitched inside it, was a mark known only to one man: the missing bishop. Tonight, we uncover how a man declared dead for over a decade was finally identified by what he once wore, and why the prophecy he delivered may have been a warning, not to the faithful, but to the people in power. Watch closely, because this story was never meant to be told. Bishop Elias Corvin had never been considered controversial. At 56, he was known for discipline, quiet charity work, and a sharp memory for church history. He rarely spoke outside prepared sermons, and he avoided internal politics completely. That changed on the morning of April 9th. More than 600 people filled St. Brigid's Cathedral when Corvin walked to the pulpit. There was no scheduled guest sermon, no special announcement on the bulletin. But instead of reading the day's scripture, he stood silently for almost a full minute. Then he said something no one expected. "There is a fire coming," he told the congregation. "Not from outside these walls, but from within them." Several witnesses later said his voice shook. He spoke about false loyalty, hidden deals, and leaders who wore holy garments while protecting something unholy. He warned that truth would be burned before it would be heard. After less than 4 minutes, Corvin ended the service early and walked out through the side exit. Church officials immediately told the congregation it was a medical episode. But 3 days later, when Corvin failed to appear for a regional clergy conference, his residence was found untouched. His phone, passport, and car were still there. Bishop Elias Corvin had simply vanished. By the 4th day after Bishop Elias Corvin disappeared, the diocese finally contacted local authorities. But the report was strangely short. No mention of the sermon. No reference to the prophecy. Only one sentence described him as a senior cleric who may have left voluntarily due to exhaustion. Detective Mara Vance was assigned to the case. She immediately noticed what felt wrong. Corvin's bedroom was neatly made. His medication sat untouched on the nightstand. A packed travel bag stood in the corner, missing only shoes. Who packs a bag and leaves barefoot? When Vance requested surveillance footage from St. Brigid's Cathedral, church administrators delayed for nearly 2 weeks. When the files finally arrived, the hallway camera that covered the bishop's private exit had been erased. Technicians blamed a system error. Vance didn't believe it. She interviewed the clergy who had been present that morning. Every single one gave the same rehearsed answer. He seemed tired. He needed rest. He said nothing unusual. But 6 members of the congregation independently told her about the warning. The fire. The betrayal. The people hiding behind holy clothing. When Vance tried to schedule a second interview with church leadership, she received a formal letter instructing her to redirect all questions to the diocesan legal office. From that moment on, the investigation slowed to a crawl. Not because there were no leads, but because someone powerful was making sure none of them were followed. For almost a year, Bishop Corvin's case sat untouched. Then a retired groundskeeper named Roland E. Vare walked into a police station with a map. He claimed that, months after the disappearance, he had been hired by an anonymous church contractor to help clear debris from a small, abandoned rural chapel nearly 60 miles outside the city. The job was paid in cash. No paperwork. No names. What made E. Vare finally speak was a smell. He told Detective Vance that beneath the collapsed wooden beams, the air had carried a thick, sweet, burned odor that clung to his clothes for days. At the time, he assumed it was animals. But when news broke that the missing bishop had never been found, the memory stayed with him. Vance followed the map. The structure was not listed in any public diocesan records. The chapel had no official name, no property history, and no maintenance trail. Only a burned foundation. Inside the blackened remains, investigators uncovered fragments of melted candlestands, shattered stained glass. And deep beneath the ash, something pale and brittle. Human bone. The fire had been intense enough to destroy almost everything. But one small object survived. A scorched strip of embroidered ceremonial fabric. Gold thread. Heavy cloth. Clothing worn only by high-ranking clergy. And sewn inside its lining was a faded personal mark. Not a name. A coded stitch pattern used exclusively by one man. Bishop Elias Corvin. The forensic team could not extract usable DNA. The heat had destroyed almost every biological trace. But the garment fragment told a different story. Detective Vance sent the fabric to a private ecclesiastical textile specialist named Professor Lucien Hallberg, one of the few experts who catalogued ceremonial clothing for high-ranking church officials. Hallberg confirmed something unsettling. The embroidery style did not belong to the region. The gold thread pattern matched a limited batch of ceremonial vestments commissioned for international clergy gatherings 15 years earlier. Only 12 had ever been produced. But what truly identified the remains was not the outer stitching. It was the lining. Bishop Elias Corvin, according to former tailoring staff, had suffered from a skin condition that made certain fabrics unbearable. He quietly paid a personal tailor to add a narrow strip of linen beneath the collar of every formal garment he owned. To keep the alteration invisible, the tailor used a unique triple-stitch pattern to secure the lining. The same pattern appeared on the burned fragment. Hidden. Deliberate. Unmistakable. For the first time in 15 years, law enforcement could officially link the destroyed remains to the missing bishop. But the revelation created a far more disturbing question. If Corvin had been burned inside that chapel shortly after disappearing, why had no one ever reported the fire? And more importantly, why did the church's internal records show that the chapel had been quietly deconsecrated only 1 week after his prophecy? The deconsecration record should have been routine. But when Detective Vance requested the original authorization file, the diocesan office sent her a scanned copy instead. The signature belonged to Archbishop Victor Hale. Hale had assumed control of the regional council less than 2 months before Bishop Corvin disappeared. According to public statements, Hale and Corvin had barely worked together. But a junior records clerk quietly told Vance a different story. The two men had met privately on several occasions in the weeks before the prophecy. Always after hours. Always off the calendar. Vance obtained a warrant to review archived internal correspondence stored on a sealed local server once used by the council. Buried inside thousands of maintenance logs and travel requests was a single encrypted file labeled only as Session Notes, LH. When digital forensics recovered the document, its contents were brief but devastating. It described a closed-door ethics inquiry involving multiple senior officials. The notes referenced unreported financial transfers routed through religious foundations and private humanitarian funds. But one line stood out. The witness refuses protection and insists on public disclosure during service. There was no name attached, but the timestamp matched the night before Bishop Corvin's sermon. For 15 years, church leadership had insisted his words were the result of stress. But this file proved something else. He was not suffering a breakdown. He was preparing to expose something. And whoever controlled that investigation had known exactly when and how he intended to do it. The next discovery came from an unexpected source. A former church logistics officer named Daniel Roque contacted Detective Mara Vance after seeing renewed media coverage of the burned chapel. Roque claimed he had helped coordinate emergency travel for senior clergy in the days following Bishop Corvin's disappearance. One name stood out: Father Matteo Klein. At the time, Klein was a little-known administrative priest working in international operations. 3 weeks after Corvin vanished, Klein was quietly reassigned to a powerful overseas post. No formal announcement. No installation ceremony. Just a sudden relocation arranged directly through Archbishop Victor Hale's office. Roque explained that the travel order attached to Klein's reassignment had been labeled Priority Continuity. That phrase was usually reserved for replacing officials who had died suddenly. But no death had been declared. Not officially. Vance began reviewing archived event footage from international religious conferences held in the years that followed. That was when she noticed something disturbing. In several public appearances, Father Matteo Klein wore ceremonial garments identical in cut and stitching to those commissioned in the same limited batch as Corvin's, including the distinctive collar style, the same narrow linen reinforcement, the same concealed stitching line. It could have been coincidence, except for one detail. In a close-up still frame, Vance spotted a faint, familiar pattern beneath the collar edge. A triple-stitch lining. The private alteration that only Bishop Corvin had ever requested. Detective Mara Vance could not legally access Father Matteo Klein's personal wardrobe records. But she didn't need to. A former ceremonial tailor named Sophia Dre had worked on international clergy garments for nearly 2 decades before retiring. When Vance showed her the close-up photograph of Klein's collar, Dre immediately froze. That lining wasn't standard, she said. Dre explained that the official batch of ceremonial garments issued years earlier had been delivered with a single reinforced seam at the collar. No exceptions. But the image showed a narrow inner strip of linen sewn beneath the fabric. And more importantly, 3 overlapping stitches crossing the same point. Dre recognized the pattern. She had repaired Bishop Elias Corvin's clothing twice during international events when his custom lining had torn. Only one tailor in their workshop had been allowed to reproduce that stitching method, because Corvin had personally asked that it never be changed. Vance asked the most dangerous question. Could someone have copied it? Dre shook her head. Not from the outside, she said. The lining is hidden. You'd only know it existed if you were holding the garment in your hands. Which meant Father Matteo Klein had not simply ordered a similar vestment. He was wearing one that had already belonged to someone else. A garment that should have been destroyed, along with the man who wore it. Detective Mara Vance requested a formal interview with Father Matteo Klein. It took 5 weeks for Church Legal Counsel to approve a brief, supervised conversation. The meeting took place in a small administrative residence owned by the International Council. 2 attorneys sat quietly behind him. A recorder was placed on the table. Klein kept his hands folded. His answers were calm, measured. When asked about Bishop Corvin, he claimed he had met him only once. When asked about the reassignment, he said he had been called to serve where needed. Then Vance asked about the garment. The room changed. Klein did not deny wearing it. He said the vestment had been issued to him by the Central Wardrobe Office after his promotion. Vance showed him the photograph. The triple-stitch lining. For the first time, his eyes dropped. He leaned forward and spoke softly. "You are looking at the wrong crime." The attorney immediately cut in and reminded him to answer only what was asked. But Klein continued. "That garment was not taken," he said. "It was passed down." Vance asked from whom. There was a long pause. Klein finally whispered a name. Not Corvin's. Another cleric. A senior official who had died unexpectedly shortly before Corvin's disappearance. Before Vance could ask for clarification, one of the attorneys reached over and turned off the recorder. The interview ended. No transcript was ever approved. And whatever Klein had almost admitted was never officially documented. The name Father Matteo Klein whispered never appeared in any public report. But Detective Mara Vance quietly traced it through sealed personnel archives. The man was Cardinal Lucian Ferris. He had overseen internal compliance reviews for international church operations. And according to private records, he had collapsed during a closed council meeting just 10 days before Bishop Corvin delivered his prophecy. The death had been attributed to natural causes. No autopsy. No external inquiry. But Ferris had also been the author of several classified internal warnings. Documents that flagged unusual financial flows routed through charitable networks connected to regional dioceses, including the one Corvin served. Vance realized something terrifying. Corvin had not been the first witness. He was the next. Cardinal Ferris died quietly. Corvin tried to speak publicly, and someone made sure he never finished. But the burned chapel raised a final, haunting problem. Forensic reconstruction revealed something the initial report had overlooked. The fire pattern showed multiple ignition points. Accelerants. The blaze had been designed to erase more than a body. It had been meant to erase a scene, to destroy evidence. Yet the careful staging had failed to consider one thing. Corvin's private alteration. The hidden stitch. The one detail no one knew to remove. The fire was meant to end the story. Instead, it preserved the only proof that could not be rewritten. The truth had survived. Inside the clothing. 15 years after Bishop Elias Corvin disappeared, Detective Mara Vance submitted her final internal report. It named no suspects. It issued no arrest warrants. It could not. Every individual tied directly to the chapel, the financial records, and the reassignment orders now fell under international jurisdiction or institutional immunity. But the pattern was undeniable. Cardinal Lucian Ferris had uncovered hidden financial operations. Bishop Corvin had agreed to testify. Father Matteo Klein had been positioned immediately after Corvin's disappearance to stabilize the same operational network. The prophecy Corvin delivered had never been symbolic. There is a fire coming, not from outside these walls. The fire was the chapel. The betrayal came from inside the council. And the man wearing holy garments while guarding something unholy was not an abstract warning. It was a role. A vacancy. One that had to be filled quickly. Corvin's words had not predicted his death. They had described the system that would erase him. When the garment fragment was officially logged into evidence, it was labeled simply as unidentified ceremonial textile. No public mention of the stitch. No reference to its significance. But Vance kept a private copy of the photograph. Because sometimes the only way a story survives is when one person refuses to let the smallest detail disappear. The prophecy had not failed. It had been fulfilled. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because what happened to Bishop Elias Corvin was not the result of one violent act. It was the result of a system built to protect itself at any cost. A man tried to speak publicly about corruption. He warned his own congregation. He used the only platform he still controlled. And for 15 years, The truth was buried beneath ash, silence, and carefully rewritten records. But one hidden stitch, a detail so small it was never meant to matter, outlived fire, power, and denial. Stories like this rarely end with arrests. They end with unanswered questions. And with institutions hoping time will erase what people forget to keep asking about. So now the question moves to you. Do we accept official silence? Or do we keep demanding transparency when powerful systems insist there is nothing to see? If you want more true crime deep dives like this, stories about hidden investigations, quiet witnesses, and the evidence no one expected to survive, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who still believes truth always finds a way out. Because sometimes, it only survives if we keep telling it.